I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
Welcome to The Trade Guys. This is Trade Guy Scott. This week we have a special episode. Bill and I were invited to provide the keynote presentation for this year's National Small Business Exporter Summit, hosted by the National Association of Small Business International Trade Educators. In this next segment, Bill and I discuss trade and the U.S. election. Andrew Schwartz moderates, and you'll hear some questions from the audience. We were happy to perform in this way and look forward to your comments about these live episodes. Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys.
Very exciting to be here today. Rebecca, thank you so much. It's always great to see you. Always great to work with the University of Maryland and with this tremendous organization that you all are part of. We're really happy to be here today. I've been talking to the trade guys all week about it. They've been fired up. They've been waiting on this day with, a lot of anticipation. Let's get to it. I suspect you don't want to talk about football. You probably don't want to talk about the World Series, but I know you want to talk about the elections. Everybody wants to talk about the elections and what they will mean for trade. Listeners of this podcast will know that we started this podcast during the lead up to the 2016 election in response to an overwhelming groundswell of requests from CSIS about trade policy, and what it would mean for America going forward. So we still have an enormous amount of enthusiasm about trade. As Bill and Scott say, trade used to be something that was talked about quietly in back rooms by lawyers and, all kinds of beltway technocrats. Now everybody talks about it, and we've even come up with a bunch of nicknames, including for former President Donald Trump, one of the candidates, Tariff Man. So if you hear anything about Tariff Man, we're talking about Donald Trump. Certainly some of Biden's policies have fallen in line with being a junior tariff man, but we'll talk more about that. Right now, though, I think we should talk about Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump's trade policies. Bill, Scott, how do they differ?
Well, they end up not all that different. I mean, there are differences, but they end up kind of in the same place on a lot of issues, but they get there by very different paths. I think it's important to spend a minute on the paths. The Trump policy has always been the policy of America as victim. The United States is the victim of the evil foreigners that are stealing our jobs, undermining our economy, and compromising our national security, and he's going to fix it. He has one narrative, and that's it. He has one metric. He looks at the bilateral trade deficit. And if you go back to his first term, he focused his energies on the countries with which we had the biggest deficits. Japan, China, Mexico. Canada was brought in because they were part of then NAFTA, subsequently USMCA. Tried to bring in Germany and then realized that they're in the EU and they have a common trade policy. And you can expect the same focus in the future. Same countries, probably adding Vietnam, where the deficit has gone up significantly, and probably adding a few others as well. And he has one tool, which is tariffs, which you've heard over and over again. We've referred to it as the sledgehammer approach because he's proposed across the board tariffs of, depending on which week it is, 10% or 20%, which would be on everything, including stuff that we don't make here, like bananas or coffee. I wrote that in a recent column, and I said, except in Hawaii. And I got a note from one of our faithful column readers who said, we no longer grow bananas in Hawaii. So I was right. Anyway.
Bill always thinks he's right, just so everybody knows that, so yes, in this case, he may
have it validated on occasion.
Yes.
Andrew, I should have been told that I'm wrong, like from my children. In any event, I think he's going to, if he gets in, I think he'll try to do that. And there's a complicated legal question about whether he could get away with it or not. We can talk about that later on if you want to, but I think the attempt we made. There's been studies done of the inflationary effect of that and the impact on the average household of pushing around $4,000 a year. And Vice President Harris has attacked it for that reason. And she has a different approach. But as I said, it's also a tariff approach. but we've referred to it as more of a scalpel approach, where they identify, the Biden administration has used this, where they've identified specific sectors, specific industries that are critical to our security and our economy that they think need protection for one reason or another. In fact, immediately before this event, I was listening to Jake Sullivan give a reprise of the speech he gave, I think, 6 months ago at the Brookings Institution, where he was explaining again what their policy is, and it's a calibrated scalpel approach. And Harris does not begin with the victim philosophy. She begins with the view that trade agreements in the past have not worked to the advantage of workers. They work to the advantage of large companies and their executives. So we need to pursue agreements that don't do that and that distribute benefits in favor of workers. What that has meant in practice is not to pursue any agreements that involve market access. So if you look at what they have done, it's been the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and the American Partnership for Economic Prosperity, APEP, neither of which includes market access proposals. And they've declined to go forward with even things that Trump started with the UK and with Kenya that could have led in the market access direction. So it's a different approach to trade. And I would argue, and have argued in past podcasts and columns, that for her, it's also a political decision. Those of you that are invested in politics know that trade is an issue that divides the Democratic Party. It's divided the Democratic Party since actually before NAFTA in the 90s, between the left that looks at trade from the perspective of imports and sees a threat to jobs, and the center, which looks at trade from the perspective of exports and sees trade as an opportunity for growth and more jobs. But there's not a lot of meeting ground between the two sides. The last fight on that was over TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a very bitter intra-party battle, even though it was President Obama that was leading the charge for that. There was a lot of opposition amongst Democrats. The Biden folks, including Harris, made a decision early on. They didn't want to have that fight again. And basically, they papered over it for the last 4 years by not pursuing agreements or negotiations that would reopen the debate. And you can expect her to do the same thing. I don't see market access agreements in our future if she's elected. Ironically, Trump might actually start more negotiations than she would. Although if you look at his negotiations, they're not reciprocal and they're not market opening for the other party. They're agreements, the ones he negotiated, which with USMCA, which is a renegotiation, Korea, which is renegotiation, Japan, which was a modest negotiation. The latter two all involve the other countries making concessions to us. They didn't involve the United States making concessions to them. So you can't really expect from either candidate a reciprocal approach to trade negotiations. And those of you that are in this business, which is most of you know, that there's really no free lunch in trade. And if you want to get something, you're going to have to give something. And we don't have candidates right now that are prepared to give anything. All that said, there are differences. The most obvious one is on climate. Harris is an environmentalist, climate, opposed USMCA because she thought it wasn't strong enough on environmental provisions. Trump is, depending on the week, more or less a climate denier, will probably pull us out of the Paris Agreement again, as he did the first time, and is not likely to pursue trade agreements that have environmental conditions. They probably differ on labor. Trump gets an enormous number of worker votes, but if you look at his record with respect to labor unions, it has been consistently to undermine them and limit their power. And he's shown really very little interest in improving that situation in third countries. The rapid response mechanism built into the USMCA agreement was really at the insistence of the Democratic House of Representatives. It was not what Ambassador Lighthizer negotiated. And I don't think you'll find them paying much attention to that going forward. The Biden folks also have built a human rights agenda into their trade profile. That's not something that Trump is likely to do. There's a difference in their view about multilateral organizations. Both administrations have undermined the WTO, but the Biden administration gives lip service to supporting it, as has Harris given lip service to supporting it. Trump is always, one step away from pulling out. He didn't do that in his first term. I wouldn't be surprised if he did it in his second term. There are differences between them on industrial policy, which I won't go into because it gets us kind of away from trade. But the Biden administration has pursued what is best called a promote and protect policy of identifying critical sectors, identifying critical industries, and simultaneously trying to promote them through the CHIPS Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, through the Inflation Reduction Act, through subsidies, through tax credits, to try to ensure that they're more competitive, knowing that we face Chinese competition in exactly those sectors in third markets. And they haven't hesitated in the Biden case, again, using a scalpel to protect specific industries that they've identified as essential to our security, either through the export control tool or through tariffs, like what they just announced recently on electric vehicles, which I would argue is an economic security issue, not a national security issue. Trump has not said a lot about industrial policy. Republicans in general oppose handouts. They think it's manipulating the market, it's interfering in the market, it's picking winners and losers. What Trump has said about this is mostly through that he proposes to promote growth in critical sectors through tax cuts. And in fact, those of you that follow Washington politics know the big debate in 2025, no matter who wins, is going to be about tax, because there's a bunch of provisions, mostly the individual ones, that expire in 2025, left over from the Trump tax bill of 2017.
Hey, Bill, I want to stop you there for a second and ask a quick question, and then I want to bring in Scott, because Scott put on a tie today for this. So it's really important to get his perspective. But first, I want to ask you, along the lines of Trump, who has juice with Trump right now? Is it Bob Lighthizer?
Yes, he's been a committed, dedicated advisor, and he's done a good job through his book of developing kind of a narrative that defends and explains Trump's philosophy. I mean, Trump wrote a book too, and his views haven't changed very much in 40 years.
You're talking about The Art of the Deal.
That's The Art of the Deal. Bob's book is Free Trade Isn't Free. And the underlying assumption that they both make, which really colors their whole philosophy, is that access to the American market is so important to other countries that they'll pay for it. And that means we have leverage, and we should make them pay for it. And if you remember in 2017, Wilbur Ross, who was the Secretary of Commerce for Trump for the entire time, gave a speech, I think one of his first speeches after he was confirmed, saying, we've been paying other countries through, tariff reductions and agreements for 40 years, and now it's their turn to pay us. That's the Trump philosophy, and that's Bob's philosophy. And his view is that they will pay because they want access to a very large growing market like ours. And Trump embellishes that by saying, and the way to make them pay is you hit them in the face and you keep hitting them in the face until they fold, which is exactly what he tried to do with the Chinese. That didn't work, but that hasn't altered his philosophy. Scott?
Yeah, Scott put on a tie, so he's got a lot to say today. I know it.
Well, yeah, thanks. And it's a question that was actually easier 3 or 4 months ago when the contest was Trump versus Biden. What you had was a circumstance where both candidates had held the office. So if you really wanted to know what Donald Trump will do on any particular subject, look at what he did when he was president for 4 years. Likewise, President Biden's policies were likely to be somewhat of a continuity versus what he was doing while he was in office. So we hadn't had that kind of direct comparison since Grover Cleveland ran again against Benjamin Harrison and won the second time. So it's been a while since we've been able to compare actual records. Now with the change to Harris, it probably is the same story, but we don't know for sure, mostly because the vice president has said very little about specific policy elements on the campaign trail. The campaigns currently remind me of, remember that old and not very successful Apple commercial, I'm a Mac, I'm a PC. They had the nerdy guy in the brown jacket as the PC and the cool kid is the Mac. Well, that doesn't tell you a lot about policy. So that's the first thing. Second.
Yeah, but the ad didn't work, but the cool kids are the Macs, aren't they?
Yes.
Just check.
Mac owners certainly think that. So
yeah, they're the only ones to think that, though. But okay.
Now, the second thing is you could wind the clock back to 2020. The Biden team, when campaigning for the job, wanted to get back to a more normal policy, less win-lose, less tariffs, and sort of go back to the multilateral system and to reciprocity. I think they found it more difficult than they thought. for whatever reason, I have some ideas, but tariffs wind up being sticky. So if you look at the record of the Biden administration, they haven't actually reduced most of the tariffs that were applied in the Trump administration. And in some cases, they've escalated them to higher levels. So that's a problem for many small businesses. For me, what I would take away from it is, candidates aside, there's a tendency from 70 years of practice to bargain over tariffs. And so once a tariff is implemented, whether it's done through a Section 301 investigation or some other statutory basis, they're very hard to bring down. And so if you're planning for a business, the thing that surprised me the most is how, despite promises to run a more normal trade policy, the operations of the Biden administration have been to leave most of the tariffs in place. So that said, I would also point out that we have, in our usual 51-49 country that tends to have elections with no winners, it's a possibility you could have changes in the House or Senate that would affect trade policy as well. And, keep in mind that constitutionally, the Congress has power to regulate foreign commerce, and there's a cooperative power sharing with the executive on matters of trade. So I think we'll have to wait and see how this settles out, see who the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is, how the Senate Finance Committee is going to operate. The Senate is, as Bill pointed out, with a strong progressive component on the Senate Finance Committee and the need for 60 votes, will probably be the most difficult place to advance any new legislation. I think it's been since 2016 that there was a meaningful trade title that actually passed through the Senate Finance Committee and was approved by the Senate and the House. So these are tough bills. They'll probably stay tough given the ingoing personnel and the need for supermajorities. But it's one of those things, we'll have to watch it carefully. I do agree with Bill that the broad-based approach that Trump had taken in the first administration is likely to be continued just because the guy is a deal maker and he's made this part of his brand and will look for ways to underscore it once in office.
All right, so let's talk about, you're talking about businesses, you're talking about deals. Guys, what should small businesses look for? Should Vice President Harris take office, or what should they look for should former President Trump take office?
Well, I actually looked at your agenda for today, and you've got three very interesting topics coming up, each of which can be affected by regulatory changes or statutory changes in trade policy. It's a moment to be alert. Your three topics are customer development, logistics, and sort of product modification, formulation, packaging, and presentation to make them relevant to your foreign consumers. So when you develop customers, you've got to make sure those are the people you can do business with. There are many restrictions on that. We have many specially designated individuals through our sanctions programs that are somewhat off limits. For logistics, you've got all the supply chain issues and the sourcing of your materials and the number of inputs you use, some of which may be affected by things like tariffs, others facing other kinds of regulation. And finally, product packaging and formulation will be subject to both U.S. and foreign regulation. So you've got an environment that's quite challenging and one that's subject to change. So, for instance, if you are right at the moment, there's a high degree of scrutiny on certain provisions that are used that often simplify the life of a small business. De minimis, for instance, was raised to $800, whereby a shipment with a value of less than $800 can process with simplified customs requirements. That was very important for any small business in the U.S. with a foreign customer, because it meant you could handle returns efficiently, that customers' returns came into the U.S. under U.S. de minimis limits, and it simplified the process for returning an item they didn't want. Now, we all know returns are normal of any business. International returns with a low de minimis can be very cumbersome. And this is a situation where something that the small business exporter benefits from, being able to handle these transactions with foreign customers, has become a target of people who look at it from the other side, who look at what's coming into the country, and they're concerned about volume from China. They're concerned about lack of inspection or lack of careful analysis by the customs agent. So there are a number of concerns. This is getting a lot of attention in Washington on all the aspects where you do business. Be forewarned, there's an unsettled environment right now and a likelihood of pressure on these things to solve problems that are other than the ones that you have.
Bill, you want to jump in on this one?
I would just say, in terms of expectations, Scott's exactly right. What you've seen is what you're going to get. And it's important to keep that in mind. I don't think Harris is going to be that different from Biden, at least in the beginning. One exception to that might be in the digital trade area, because she comes from California. I mean, Biden and Trump are both, I did a column once called Lost in the 50s Tonight, which for those of you that are country music fans is a Ronnie Millsap song. But they're both kind of lost in the 50s, although Trump actually is lost in the 1890s because he's got this affection for William McKinley and high tariffs. But they're both old line, heavy manufacturing guys, steel, cars, metal, things like that, And Harris is from California and has a very different background, doesn't come from that culture. At the same time, the politics for both of them haven't changed all that much. Whoever wins is going to win because of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and, North Carolina, Georgia, the ones you've all been reading about. Those are states where, some of them, where old manufacturing is very important. If Harris wins, it won't be because of California. It'll be because of Pennsylvania and Michigan. So she's going to have to continue to pay as much attention to heavy industry, if you will, as Biden did, and Trump is already there. So don't assume a big change. The one space that might be different is in the digital area, which impacts virtually everybody, small, large, service provider, manufacturer, everybody is digitized. And she may have a more forward-looking view on that than either the Biden administration has had recently or Trump. Remains to be seen.
Bill, you mentioned, I got to stop you on this for a second. You mentioned President William McKinley, who held office from 1897 to 1901. And I want to read you something that historian Heather Cox Richardson wrote this morning. She said, and I quote, that Trump has said he thinks the word tariff is as beautiful as the word love or faith, and has frequently praised President William McKinley for leading the United States to become what he says the wealthiest it ever was. Trump attributes that wealth to tariffs, but unlike leaders in the 1890s, Trump refuses to acknowledge that tariffs do not bring money in from other countries, but rather the cost of tariffs is borne by the American consumers. What do you say to that? And Scott, I want your reaction.
I'd say that's right. There's been a lot of research done on that. One of my columns was just titled Tariffs Are on the Menu, Who's Eating Them? Most of the tariff gets passed on to consumers. Those of you that import or know the importing scene know that technically it's the importer that pays the tariff. The question then is, who is that passed on to? Sometimes the importer eats it or eats part of it and only passes some of it on. If you're a huge buyer like Walmart, hypothetically, you can go back to, they can go back to their suppliers in other countries and say, look, we need you to take part of the hit here because otherwise we won't buy from you. And they've got market leverage and can do that. But most of the tariff gets passed on to consumers. And of course, what Trump ignores, he ignores two things. One, it talks about McKinley having, used tariffs to fund the federal budget, which is true because it was before the income tax amendment to the Constitution was passed, which was in 1916. But he also forgets the fact that the federal government budget was in 1897 was a tiny fraction of what it is now. And it was a lot easier to fund the government then than it is now. We're talking trillions, where the estimate of what the Trump's tariffs would raise, the maximum reference is something like $300 billion, which is way, way short of funding the government, even though he's said that he would be able to do that. The other difference he said is if we have really high tariffs, that'll force companies to move here. And what we want is manufacturing in the United States. This is reshoring. And Biden is for reshoring too, although he hasn't proposed, 100% tariffs to get there. Trump thinks that the higher the tariff, the more likely it is to force the foreign company to move to the United States. What he ignores, of course, is if the tariff is that high, nobody's going to pay it and there won't be any revenue because there won't be any trade. If you have a 100% tariff, you're not going to try to sell here. You're not going to be able to find a market. So tariffs not paid. Will that force you to move to the United States? I doubt it, because there are other options out there in the world. We're not the only market. But even if it did, it's going to take you, for the most part, years to do it. You can't just, maybe if you make T-shirts, you can shut off the lights in Chengdu and, open them in Atlanta next week. But even there, it's harder than that. And if you make anything complicated, you're talking years. Just our permitting processes alone will take you years. So she's right, bottom line. What's interesting is people keep confronting him with that, and he just blows right past it. He's incorrigible on the subject. And actually, Biden it's interesting. I mentioned earlier, Jake Sullivan was speaking this morning, and he was asked one of the second question, point blank, was Jake was defending Biden's tariffs on critical commodities, critical sectors, chips, EVs. And the moderator asked him, yeah, but when it came to the Trump tariffs, you didn't get rid of the Trump tariffs on apparel or the Trump tariffs on shoes or the Trump tariffs on toys, none of which are critical. Why didn't you do that? And Jake dodged the question. He said, well, that was political and he didn't want to get involved in the campaign. So,
Yeah. Well, it's hard. Tariffs are sticky. But look, the consumer pays all costs. Okay. Just like they pay freight and they pay transport and storage and everything else. Ultimately, the ultimate consumer pays the cost of tariffs. The only other thing I would say about William McKinley is that since he made his home in Canton, Ohio, there was no doubt in my mind that had he been around today, he would have been a strong Ohio State Buckeyes fan.
The Ohio State University.
Yes.
Ohio has a record of sending terrible presidents to the White House. Warren Harding was from Ohio also, as I recall.
That's correct.
Cleveland Browns also have a history of picking terrible quarterbacks, but
sometimes this happens, Bill.
But keep in mind
that
important?
Warren Harding won an election. Warren Harding won an election against another Ohioan, James Cox, the newspaper magnate, was the Democratic candidate in 1920 when Harding won. So you'd have gotten an Ohioan either way, Bill.
Yeah, Bill, don't mess with Scott on Ohio. You know better.
He was the last one, wasn't he? The last one from Ohio. Has there been an Ohioan since Warren Harding? He kind of broke the mold.
I think he was the last.
And J.D. Vance is trying to become, I believe, the next. So, guys, let's switch it up a little bit. We've talked about the candidates. Let's talk about trade and services. The U.S. trade deficit with China eliminated 3.7 million jobs between 2001 and 2018, with over 75% of those jobs being lost in the manufacturing sector. The decline reflects the displacement of U.S. goods by cheaper Chinese imports, known as the China trade shock. We talk about this all the time on the podcast, but what drove America to be a service economy, and what was the role of trade in that shift?
There are different theories about that. You've just articulated one of them, that it was imports that did it. And there's research that suggests there was indeed a China shock, most of it between 2001 and 2011, not all of it, most of it, and that you can fairly convincingly, according to the authors, David Autor and several others, attribute job losses directly to Chinese imports, at least during that period. They've subsequently done some research to suggest that was kind of a wave that passed through the economy and will not be repeated, at least by the Chinese. They didn't address the question of whether we, next 5 years from now, we have to worry about the Indians. We'll see. But there's an alternative theory, and it's actually embodied in a paper that we published back in 2021 by Stephen Rose, who's an economist. You can get it on our csis.org website. Go to the Scholl chair, and it's back there somewhere in past publications, called Do Not Blame Trade for the Decline in Manufacturing Jobs. And that's the title of it. And Stephen's point is basically most of the job loss was due to productivity and technology improvement. That, for example, in the steel industry, we are making as much steel now as we made 40 years ago with 1/4 the jobs. And so that's not a decline of production. That's not a decline in manufacturing. It's a decline in the number of people it takes to make the product. And that is due to technology improvements and the development of electric arc furnaces, for one thing, in that industry. People are projecting we risk the same problem with electric vehicles. That's a simpler structure than the internal combustion engine. Probably is going to mean fewer auto workers on the automobile assembly line. It probably is also going to mean more battery workers. So not necessarily fewer jobs, but a change in the nature of the work and a change in the nature of the jobs. But overall, you can make a compelling case that while manufacturing employment declined from 1955 till 2019 from 32% of the labor force to 8%, a lot of that was due to productivity improvement and technology improvement. But all those people, they didn't just disappear. They ended up in service jobs, some of them low end. Trump illustrated that last week when he spent 5 minutes at McDonald's dishing out fries. That's a service job, but there are high-end services jobs too, in the medical profession, in engineering, in lawyering, and in a host of other professional jobs as well.
Yeah, the U.S. still manufactures. Our output is still very large, but it's done much more productively. Much like in 1900, half of us would have been farmers. Now 2% of us are farmers. The job content of a farmer has changed a lot, but their output has changed dramatically.
But if you look at growth, this I found was interesting. First half of this year, this is world growth. It tells you something, not just us. The value of world goods trade was essentially flat. It increased 0.1%. Services grew by 8% in the first quarter of this year. If you look at it by volume rather than by value, that both increased. Goods trade volume increased 2.7%. Services, I think, went up by around 2.6%. So the American economy now is over 75% services. And it's ironic that both candidates are spending an enormous time talking about 8% of the population, basically, when it comes to jobs, and very little time talking about what it takes to increase and improve services economy and services exports. And I keep waiting for that from both of them. And it'll come up what you guys face going forward. Just to go back to Andrew's earlier question, is maybe a small change trade package before the end of the year we'll see that would address de minimis reforms, GSP renewal, maybe a miscellaneous tariff bill, not clear. Looking ahead, though, next year is really going to be a tax debate. I already commented on that. There may be trade issues that come up, but looking ahead, you've got AGOA renewal will be the big issue of 2025 in trade and 2026. And you've got USMCA review, which will consume an awful lot of oxygen. Both candidates have already said they intend to renegotiate part of the USMCA agreement, different parts, but well, in one case, the same part. They both want to renegotiate the auto rules. So there's a big agenda out there. We don't lobby at CSIS, but I think it's important for you guys to make sure your interests are heard. And I have to say, it's really hard for small companies to weigh in. You need to work with the associations that you're members of. Scott?
I agree with you, Bill. And making sure your voice is heard is the most challenging part of any of these issues. They're complicated. You usually have determined opposition, whatever your point is. So you got to be strong. We're about to run out of time. Did we get any questions, Andrew?
We
do.
We answered one of them.
What's that, Bill?
We answered one of them already, which is what can you expect? We did that one.
Sure.
So, Andrew, you got any more?
Yes. Ronald Reagan used quotas on the Japanese auto manufacturers to protect the U.S. auto industry. Japan then chose to build factories in the U.S. Still, a protectionist policy brought industry to the U.S., maybe unintended consequences to get around the quota. Would this be a better strategy today than tariffs? Would it have the same kind of results?
Good question. Scott's answer may be different. My answer would be yes, except for the fact that this time around we're talking about China. There's a real question about the extent to which Chinese companies are going to be welcome here. I mean, if those of you that are ancient like me will remember that Japanese companies moving here were controversial in the 80s, and we got over that. China is more complicated. Japan was never a national security threat. It was an economic threat. The Soviet Union was reverse. It was never an economic threat. It was a national security threat. China's both. Between our restrictions on inbound investment and China's own hesitancy to invest here, I'm not sure that's going to be a remedy for them. But in theory, I think it's a better approach. Scott?
It's an excellent question. I would say that it really depends on the industry, but I would also say that because of changes in technology and the widespread distribution of production so that many things are made on planet Earth, not in any specific place, it's much more difficult to characterize any industrial output as being from a single nation. The world's changed, and the world of production has changed quite dramatically. It's a very selective benefit. You'd have to have exactly the right industry at the right time. Maybe IT silicon chips is one of them that's still very high capital, that still has some strategic and technological expertise required. That might work, but it would be harder to pull off even Reagan's policy, given the changes in the way things are made in the world.
A good current example is batteries, but that's the Koreans. And
Yes.
they're making significant investments here, Georgia, Michigan. I think there's one going in Ohio as well. I'm not sure.
That's correct. Yes.
Trade guys, Scott, Bill, Andrew, Evan as well. Thank you so much for having been a part of the summit today. It's been a real privilege and an honor and a hoot, as always, to host you this morning. Again, thank you for being here.
And thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.